Not having a will in place at the time of one's passing has dire effects on the lives of the loved ones left behind. Joining us to highlight the importance of estate planning, especially where children are involved, is Faeeza Khan, a legal marketing specialist at Liberty South Africa. Thank you, Faeeza, for joining us on this Friday. What's the difference between a will and an estate plan? Is it one and the same thing?
Thank you so much for having me, Dudu. And it is a little bit different. A will is your last wishes. It's a document that contains what you want to happen to your estate in the event of your death. And a will is normally used as a tool in estate planning. Estate planning looks at what your estate, what your estate looks like essentially, and what you want to achieve and what your intention is. And so a will would support that intention and that estate plan. It's a comprehensive analysis.
When it comes to children, what is the default solution, or what happens especially in terms of the law in South Africa when one passes away? You'd want to ensure that you consider what happens to your children when you are thinking about estate planning and when you are thinking about drafting a will. Because essentially what would happen in the event of a parent passing away is that either the surviving parent, if that parent is in the child's life, who's the natural guardian of the child, would then take over care of this child. And in the absence of the natural guardian being able to take care of the child, a legal guardian would have to be appointed by a court of law. And you'd want, as a parent, to ensure that you at least nominate this potential legal guardian in terms of a will. So you'd really need someone to look after the child, because the child, as a minor, lacks capacity to act and transact. And so it's important that there is the seamless transition, well, as much as it can be seamless, so that you as a parent knows what's going to happen to your child in the event of your death and who's going to be the caregiver of your child. So even when there's a natural guardian, you can still nominate a legal guardian to take care of the child?
Yeah, so sometimes what happens is that the natural guardian might not be in the child's life. So it would be prudent to have an alternative. Sometimes the natural guardian doesn't have a relationship with the child, and so you'd want the court to consider an alternative guardian to look after the child. So yes, I'd say definitely nominate an alternative guardian in terms of your will.
Then what are the options available to protect the inheritance of a child?
I think that, if you don't have a will, what would happen to the inheritance of a child is that the entire portion of the estate that's supposed to be given to the child would have to be converted to cash and held by the guardian's fund, which is a trust that is associated with the Master of the High Court. And that might not be the intention of the parents. And so what you'd want as a non-negotiable is definitely a will. And in the will, you'd want to make provision for a testamentary trust. And this testamentary trust is essentially what would be used to house the inheritance of the minor child, because this trust can hold immovable property and different types of assets without having to liquidate those assets and converting them to cash. And so you'd have a will, you'd make provision for a testamentary trust, you'd nominate your trustees, because those are the people that is really going to administer and control those assets on behalf of the minor child. And then when the child becomes a major, or at whatever date that you as the parent chooses in terms of your will, would then get control of those assets.
What are some of the worst cases that you have seen when a parent transitions and a child is then, left alone? There's no will, there's no estate planning.
Sure. Some of the backlash can really be that there's uncertainty. No one really knows who is going to take care of this child. You have family members that are fighting, for primary care of this child. Not all the family members get along. The child might not have relationships with
with certain family members, and that's something that has happened. So you want to make sure that that conversation doesn't happen, that there is certainty that you've earmarked a potential guardian, so that, there's no resentment or fights over who's going to be the primary caregiver of the child. But then also on the back foot of that is where you haven't made provision for a testamentary trust, for example, and, because your entire estate would need to be liquidated and held by the guardian's fund, what happens is that in that estate is your home. And that's the home that the child is supposed to live in the future with the guardian. But because this asset is supposed to go to the child, that asset is then liquidated. It's sold off by the executor, and the cash is then transferred to the guardian's fund. And the guardian would have to claim maintenance from the guardian's fund, which is another thing that has happened in practice. And so you want to circumvent situations like that, and you want to make sure that, you do protect this inheritance that you've worked so hard for, this legacy that you want to leave to your children. And so you do the estate planning and you back it up with a will.
Absolutely. Faeeza Khan, a legal marketing specialist at Liberty South Africa.